The world, for Sergeant Frank Miller of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment's Pathfinder Platoon, had shrunk to the size of a steel bucket. It was the interior of a C-47 Skitran, roaring through the pre-dawn blackness of June 6, 1944. The air was a foul cocktail of aviation fuel, vomit, and the damp wool smell of nervous men. 18 of them, packed shoulder to shoulder, were encased in a vibrating metal womb, pregnant with violence. Each man was a walking arsenal, weighed down by his rifle, his grenades, his rations, his life. But Miller carried an extra burden. Strapped to his leg was a 40-pound Eureka beacon, a piece of high-tech wizardry that was supposed to be the key to everything. He was a pathfinder, the tip of the spear, the very first man, part of a tiny, elite group meant to drop into Normandy a full hour ahead of the main invasion force. The plan, as it had been rehearsed 100 times on the manicured fields of England, was a masterpiece of military clockwork. They would jump, assemble in minutes, and deploy their beacons and signaling lamps. Then, the sky would fill with thousands of paratroopers, descending like angels onto the perfectly marked drop zones. It was a plan built on precision, a cold, clean equation of time and distance. A plan whose failure would doom not just the men in this plane, but the 10,000 who would follow them into blindness. Miller mouthed the name of his target again, a private prayer against the engine's deafening sermon drop zone Charlie. He could see it in his mind's eye, a flat, open field bordered by two distinctive hedgerows, a crooked oak tree on its southern edge. He had memorized every contour, every shadow. The map wasn't just on paper, it was burned into his brain. Then, the world outside the little porthole window turned into hell. It wasn't a gradual change. It was a sudden, violent spasm. The plane, which had been bucking in the thick cloud banks, was now being punched by an invisible fist. The night erupted in flashes of incandescent, angry red and white. German flak. A sound like a giant tearing sheets of canvas ripped through the fuselage, and the entire plane lurched sideways, throwing men against each other. The clean equation of the plan was being violated by the messy, chaotic grammar of combat. The green light, the signal to jump, was still minutes away. But the pilots, young men who had never flown through a curtain of fire like this, were panicking. You could feel it in the bones of the aircraft. The jump master, a lieutenant with eyes as wide as dinner plates, screamed an order that was swallowed by the chaos. The red light over the door flickered, then inexplicably blinked green. Now. It can't be now. We're too fast. We're too low. Miller's mind screamed the protest, but his body, drilled by a year of relentless training, obeyed. He was a creature of instinct now. He shuffled forward in the line, hooked his static line to the anchor cable, and in a rush of wind and noise, hurled himself into the abyss. The prop blast hit him like a physical blow, a hurricane that tore at him, tumbling him end over end. He fought to get stable, counted to 4, and felt the glorious, violent jerk of his parachute deploying. The world went from a deafening roar to an almost serene silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind through his risers. Below him, there was nothing but an endless, featureless black. No lights, no beacons from other Pathfinder teams, just the void. He looked up, searching for the comforting sight of other parachutes blossoming in the dark. He saw none. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The landing was brutal. He didn't hit a soft pasture, but a chaos of branches and leaves. He crashed through a tree, the precious Eureka beacon taking the brunt of the impact, and slammed into the ground, the air driven from his lungs. For a long minute, he just lay there, tangled in his chute, gasping. The silence of Normandy was immense. It was a living thing, punctuated by the distant, rhythmic growl of the flak that had tried to kill him. He cut himself free, pulled out his compass, and waited for its luminous dial to settle. He knew where north was. He just had no idea where he was. This wasn't Drop Zone Charlie. There was no flat field, no crooked oak. There were only trees and the suffocating darkness of a dense wood. The map in his head, his most vital piece of equipment, was now a work of complete fiction. He, the man meant to be the guiding light for an entire army, was lost. And this is where the official history, the one written on the maps back in London, goes silent. Because the plan, so perfect in its conception, had just collided with the brutal reality of a single, misplaced soldier. He was miles from his target. His mission was a failure before it had even begun, and in less than an hour, 10,000 men would be leaping out of planes, expecting a light in the darkness that would never turn on. Back in England, on the windswept tarmac of RAF North Witham, Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, watched the last of his C-47s disappear into the overcast gloom. For him, the battle was now an exercise in abstract faith. He was a king who had moved his pieces onto the board and now could do nothing but wait, staring at a map that was, at this moment, the only reality he had. On that map, Drop Zone Charlie was a neat, precise green rectangle. Sergeant Miller and his Pathfinder team were a microscopic, assumed to be exactly where they were ordered to be. The entire operational plan for the 101st, a complex symphony of men and material, was predicated on this single, foundational assumption: the Pathfinders will succeed. The official explanation for what would happen next was simple. For the first 60 minutes, there would be radio silence. This was standard procedure, a necessary precaution. Then, precisely at H-hour-30, the first coded signals would crackle to life, confirming the beacons were active. The main airborne armada, already en route, would home in on those signals, delivering thousands of paratroopers with what the planners called acceptable dispersion. It was a clinical, almost sterile vision of war. It was clean. It was logical. But the war wasn't happening on Maxwell Taylor's map. It was happening in the terror-filled cockpit of a C-47 piloted by a 22-year-old from Ohio who was flying through a solid wall of anti-aircraft fire for the first time in his life. The official plan accounted for flak, of course. It had neat percentages for expected aircraft losses. What it couldn't account for was the purely human reaction of a pilot under extreme duress. The instinct to accelerate. The urge to climb or dive. To do anything to escape the lattice of incandescent steel erupting around him. These pilots weren't deviating from the plan out of cowardice, they were fighting for their lives. And in doing so, they were scattering their human cargo across the Norman countryside like seeds thrown into a gale. On the ground, Sergeant Frank Miller was the first piece of evidence that the official story was a lie. After extricating himself from the tree, he did what he was trained to do. He checked his gear. His rifle was intact. His compass worked. But the Eureka beacon, the 40-pound heart of his mission, was a wreck. The impact with the tree had shattered its delicate vacuum tubes and bent the antenna into a useless metal corkscrew. It was no longer a sophisticated piece of electronics, it was just dead weight. He unstrapped it and let it fall to the forest floor with a dull thud. His mission, the official one, anyway, was over. He wasn't alone for long. A few minutes later, a twig snapped nearby. Miller flattened himself against the wet earth, rifle ready, his heart hammering against his ribs. A figure emerged from the shadows, not a German, but another American, his face pale in the faint moonlight. It was a trooper from the 82nd Airborne, a division that was supposed to be landing nearly 20 miles to the west. The man's eyes were wide with the same disorientation Miller felt. "Where the hell are we?" he whispered, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Before Miller could answer, two more figures appeared. They were from his own unit, the 101st, but from a different company, a different battalion, men he'd never met before. They were supposed to be on Drop Zone Able, 5 miles north. This was the first hint of the true, terrifying picture. Imagine you're a librarian who has spent a year meticulously organizing a massive library, only to have a tornado rip through the building, scattering every book at random. That was what was happening to the airborne divisions over Normandy. They weren't an army anymore. They were a collection of terrified individuals and tiny, bewildered groups, dropped miles from their targets, with no officers, no orders, and no idea where they were or what they were supposed to be doing. The plan on the map in England still showed a neat, orderly invasion. But the reality on the ground was a single, undeniable fact: the army was broken. It had shattered into 1,000 pieces before it had even fired a shot. This wasn't just a logistical hiccup. It was a potential catastrophe of the highest order, a flaw so deep it threatened to unravel the entire western flank of the D-Day landings. To understand why, you have to look at the Normandy invasion not as a single battle, but as a vast, interconnected machine. Think of it like a delicate surgical operation. The amphibious landings on the beaches Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, sword were the main incision. But for that surgery to succeed, you first had to sever the nerves and arteries leading to the area. The airborne divisions were the scalpel, designed to make those critical cuts deep inside enemy territory before the patient, the German army, even knew the operation had begun. The 101st Airborne had a very specific and utterly vital job. They were tasked with securing the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. These causeways were the key. The area directly behind Utah was a coastal marsh, deliberately flooded by the Germans under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. It was a brilliant piece of defensive engineering. He had turned the landscape into a weapon. For the tens of thousands of American soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division set to land at dawn, there were only 4 viable exits off the beach and through this impassable swampland. For narrow, elevated roads. If the Germans held those causeways, the 4th Division would be trapped in a kill zone, pinned between the English Channel and the flooded fields, and systematically annihilated by German artillery. The entire plan for the American landings at Utah Beach, the lives of 30,000 men, the tanks, the trucks, the whole colossal weight of the invasion, rested on the assumption that a few thousand paratroopers would seize and hold the inland exits of those causeways. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble, a strategic masterpiece of timing and coordination. But now, that masterpiece was in pieces. The paratroopers weren't landing in concentrated, combat-effective groups on their designated drop zones near the causeways. They were being sprinkled over 50 square miles of hostile territory. Instead of a cohesive fighting force, they were becoming isolated pockets of men, disoriented and vulnerable. The scalpel hadn't made a clean cut, it had shattered on impact. Every minute that ticked by was a minute the Germans could use to organize, to reinforce the causeway defenses, and to turn Rommel's waterlogged trap into a meat grinder for the men landing at dawn. The ticking clock wasn't just metaphorical. It was real. General Maxwell Taylor, still in England, was now seeing the first fragments of the disaster filter back. Cryptic pilot debriefs spoke of intense flak and heavy cloud cover. Radio silence from the Pathfinder teams persisted long past its scheduled end. The abyss of the unknown was staring him in the face. Imagine spending your entire life learning the rules to a game of chess, only to watch the enemy flip the board over and start beating you with the pieces. That was the feeling in Allied high command that night. The plan, the great, beautiful, intricate plan, was dead on arrival. On the ground, Sergeant Frank Miller didn't know the grand strategy. He just knew his reality. He now had a small, ad hoc group of 4 men himself, the trooper from the 82nd, and the 2 from his own division. None of them knew where they were. But one thing united them: the distant, intermittent sound of gunfire to the east. It was a weak magnet pulling them through the darkness. They didn't have a mission from high command anymore. The orders they'd memorized were now useless. So, in the dripping wet darkness of a Norman forest, miles from where they were supposed to be, they made a decision. It wasn't a strategic choice born of careful planning. It was the most basic, primal decision a soldier can make. They would walk toward the sound of the guns. A new, undeclared mission had just begun. Find the war you were supposed to be fighting. For the next hour, Miller's tiny, impromptu squad moved through a landscape that felt like a nightmare. They waded through waist-deep water and flooded fields, the cold shocking them to the core. They crept along the bases of the infamous Normandy hedgerows, ancient earthen walls 10 feet high and thick with tangled roots and thorns, turning the countryside into a suffocating maze of green corridors. Every rustle of leaves was a German patrol, every shadow a machine gun nest. The whole world was an ambush waiting to happen. They weren't soldiers executing a plan, they were prey, listening for the snap of a twig that would signal their end. Their only guide was the cacophony of the invasion, a symphony of chaos playing out across the peninsula. The distant, heavy thump of naval bombardment from the fleet offshore, the tearing fabric sound of machine gun fire, sometimes miles away, sometimes terrifyingly close, the crump of mortars. War has a geography of sound, and these men were learning to read it on the fly. They navigated by ear, drawn toward the sound of their own side, repelled by the distinct, high-pitched chatter of German MG-42s. Then, they found it. The first real clue. As they crawled to the top of a hedgerow to survey the land ahead, they saw it. Below them, nestled in a small, sunken crossroads, was a German staff car. A sleek, black Kubelwagen. It was parked next to a stone farmhouse, a faint, yellow light leaking from a crack in the blackout shutters. A single German sentry stood near the car, his silhouette sharp against the pre-dawn glow, casually smoking a cigarette. He looked bored, complacent. He clearly had no idea that an army had just fallen out of the sky on top of him. This was a moment of pure, unadulterated opportunity. Miller's training screamed at him, avoid contact. Your mission is to assemble. But what was his mission now? The question was meaningless. Here, in front of them, was a tangible piece of the enemy. It was a target. More than that, it was a source of information. A staff car implied officers. Officers meant maps, documents, radios. It was a chance to stop being lost and to start understanding the new, terrifying chessboard they were on. Miller didn't need to say a word. He looked at the other three men, their faces grimy and taut with tension, and saw the same thought reflected in their eyes. They were a unit now, forged in the shared terror of the last hour. He gave a series of silent hand signals, the simple, brutal grammar of an infantry assault he'd practiced 1,000 times. The man from the 82nd would provide covering fire. He and the other two would flank, hitting the house from two sides. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. It was the first coherent thought they'd had since leaving the plane. The approach was agonizingly slow, a crawl through wet grass and mud that seemed to take an eternity. Every inch was a victory over their own screaming nerves. Miller could feel the cold dew soaking through the knees of his trousers, the rough texture of his rifle stock pressed against his cheek. He could smell the sentry's cigarette smoke on the damp air. They moved into position, a triangle of death closing in on the unsuspecting farmhouse. The sentry flicked his cigarette away, a tiny orange arc in the darkness, and turned to walk back toward the door. That was the signal. Miller took a final, steadying breath. For the first time that night, he wasn't a lost boy in the dark. He was a hunter. The feeling was electric, a surge of adrenaline that banished fear and doubt. They had stumbled out of the fog of war and found a single, illuminated point of clarity. They were about to kick the door down and find out what the enemy knew. The assault was over in 20 seconds of savage, concentrated violence. The trooper from the 82nd opened up with his M1 Garand, the distinctive ping of its en-bloc clip echoing in the sudden quiet that followed his 8 shots. The sentry went down without a sound. Miller and his 2 men hit the farmhouse door simultaneously. It splintered under the force of their combined weight, and they poured inside, a whirlwind of aggression and American steel. The scene inside was one of mundane German bureaucracy, now violently interrupted. 2 officers, a major and a captain, sat at a rough wooden table, frozen in surprise over a map illuminated by a single kerosene lamp. Their pistols were still in their holsters. Before they could even rise, the room erupted in gunfire. It wasn't a firefight, it was an execution. Miller and his men were operating on pure, adrenalized instinct, the culmination of a year of training that screamed one simple rule: hesitation is death. When the cordite smoke cleared, the 2 Germans lay slumped over their table. The quiet that descended was heavier, more profound than before. Miller's ears rang. He scanned the room, his rifle ready, but it was over. The only sound was the frantic ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece and the soft hiss of the lamp. Then, the elation, the hunter's thrill, evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening reality. The dead major's face was young, almost boyish. He couldn't have been more than 30. War, which had been an abstract concept of objectives and drop zones, was now the smell of blood and spilled coffee in a French farmhouse, a ticking clock, and 2 dead men who had been alive 10 seconds ago. But there was no time for reflection. Miller's eyes were drawn to the map on the table. He grabbed it, his hands slick with sweat. It was a German staff map of the immediate area, marked with grease pencil annotations. And as he stared at it, the initial surge of victory curdled into a knot of ice in his stomach. This wasn't just a clue, it was a revelation of the enemy's genius. The map was a portrait of a perfectly prepared defense. Every key bridge, every crossroads, every potential choke point was marked with the symbol for a machine gun nest or an anti-tank gun. But it was worse than that. The Germans had done something brilliant and diabolical. The map showed that the secondary roads, the small country lanes the paratroopers were expected to use if the main causeways were blocked, were not just defended, they were booby-trapped. They were pre-sighted for mortars. The hedgerows lining them were wired with mines. The Germans hadn't just built a wall to stop the invasion, they had built a labyrinth designed to bleed it to death. They knew the terrain better than the Allies did, and they had turned every inch of it into a weapon. The farmhouse, which a minute ago had seemed like a random target of opportunity, was clearly a local command post. These men weren't just waiting for an invasion, they were expecting it, and they had a detailed, meticulous plan to defeat it. The Americans weren't landing in a state of confusion against an equally confused enemy. They were landing, utterly disorganized, in the middle of a perfectly laid trap. Miller's simple theory, find other Americans, group up, attack the objective, had just collapsed. He looked at the faces of his men. The same dawning horror was reflected in their eyes. They weren't the hunters. They had just stumbled into the spider's web, and the map they held was a blueprint drawn by the spider itself. The German map was a death sentence. It showed a prepared battlefield, a killing ground where every advantage lay with the defender. For Miller and his small band, it confirmed they were adrift in an ocean of overwhelming enemy strength. The logical military response would be to hide, to wait for the main force from Utah Beach to break through, to melt back into the woods and engage in low-level harassment. Survival, not victory, was now the rational objective. But soldiers on the ground, fueled by adrenaline and a sense of profound isolation, don't always operate on logic. They operate on instinct, and something else was beginning to dawn on them. The breakthrough came from the trooper from the 82nd Airborne. His name was Dawson, a quiet corporal from a Pennsylvania coal town. While Miller was staring at the map, transfixed by the sheer scale of the German preparations, Dawson had been rummaging through the dead major's field satchel. He pulled out a leather-bound logbook and a sheaf of papers held together with a clip. He couldn't read German, but he could read numbers and symbols. He laid the papers next to the map. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Look at this." He pointed to a series of notations in the logbook. They were timetables. Precise, Germanically efficient timetables. 0430 Mortar Platoon reports readiness at Point Gamma. 0500 Ammunition resupply for MG Nest at Crossroads, X-ray complete. 0530 Relief Patrol for Bridge Alpha departs. It was the enemy's entire operational schedule for the night. The papers were the corresponding orders for those units. This was the moment the nature of the war changed for them. Imagine you are a burglar, breaking into a house you believe is empty, only to find the owner's detailed minute-by-minute schedule for the entire day sitting on the kitchen table. Suddenly, you are no longer blind. You have a God's eye view. You know where he will be, and more importantly, where he won't be. The map showed the enemy's strength, their fixed positions. But the logbook and the orders showed their weakness, their routine, their predictability. The Germans had a plan, yes, but a plan is a rigid thing. It creates patterns, and patterns can be broken. Miller, Dawson, and the other two men huddled around the flickering lantern, the bodies of the German officers forgotten at their feet. They were no longer just four lost paratroopers. They were a functioning intelligence cell. They had something more valuable than 100 extra men. They had the enemy's playbook. They could see the seams in the German defense. They knew a supply truck was scheduled to travel down a certain road in 20 minutes. They knew a command patrol was due to inspect a bridge defense at 0530. They knew which positions had just been resupplied and were therefore at their strongest, and which were likely running low. A new, audacious path forward revealed itself. They couldn't fight the German army head-on, they would be annihilated. But they didn't have to. They could use this intelligence to become ghosts. They could strike the enemy at precisely the moments he was most vulnerable. They could ambush the resupply truck. They could impersonate the relief patrol. They could hit the command post just after the commander had left to do his rounds. They wouldn't be fighting the German war machine, they would be dismantling it, piece by piece, from the inside out. It was a terrifying, almost suicidal idea, but it was better than hiding in a ditch waiting to die. In the bloody classroom of a ruined farmhouse, they had found a new, more dangerous curriculum. Armed with their captured intelligence, Miller's four-man team became something lethal and unforeseen. They were a virus injected into the German operational bloodstream. They left the farmhouse and melted back into the hedgerow labyrinth, but now they moved with a predatory purpose. Their first target was the ammunition resupply truck mentioned in the logbook, scheduled to be at a specific crossroads at 0500. They got there 10 minutes early, setting up a hasty L-shaped ambush. The truck, a lumbering Opel Blitz, arrived right on time, its headlights cutting feeble cones through the misty dawn. The driver and his guard likely felt perfectly secure, following a routine schedule on what they believed was a pacified rear echelon road. Their confidence was their undoing. The ambush was savage and brief. A grenade in the cab, a burst of fire into the canvas-covered rear, and it was over. They didn't just destroy the truck, they took what they could carry: German potato masher grenades, belts of machine gun ammunition, and most valuable of all, 2 Panzerfausts, disposable anti-tank rockets. They were transforming. Every encounter fed their lethality. They were no longer just an American squad, they were a hybrid, using the enemy's own weapons against him. They were fighting a different kind of war now, not for territory, but for chaos. They knew from the captured timetable that a bicycle patrol was due to pass a certain bridge. They mined the road with one of their own grenades, rigging a tripwire. They didn't even stay to watch. They just moved on, leaving a deadly surprise behind them, trusting in the enemy's rigid adherence to his schedule. But as they moved, picking their targets, sowing confusion, they began to encounter other lost paratroopers. They became a magnet for the lost. At every hedgerow, it seemed, they found more men leaderless, disoriented, but desperate to fight. Miller's stolen map was the only coherent plan in a world of chaos, and men flocked to it like a banner. A group of 5 from the 506th Regiment, led by a determined but mapless lieutenant. A pair of demolition specialists from an engineering battalion, their explosives intact, but their objective unknown. A lone machine gunner from the 82nd, who had been wandering for hours. Each time, Miller would show them the German map and the captured logbook. The effect was always the same: a sudden, shocking clarity. The despair of being lost was replaced by the cold fury of having a target. By the time the sun had fully risen, painting the Norman sky in shades of pink and gray, Miller's ad hoc squad of 4 had grown to nearly 30 men. They were a bizarre, motley collection from a dozen different units, a military Frankenstein's monster. And they were heading toward an objective that wasn't on any of their original orders. The German map showed a small, stone bridge over the Douve River, near a village called St. Miragelis. The map designated it Bridge Alpha, and the captured orders revealed its significance. It was the primary route for a company of Panzer IV tanks to move from their garrison and counterattack the beaches. The logbook stated that the main German force was scheduled to cross it at 0730. This was it. The uncomfortable truth. Their official mission, the one assigned to them by generals in England, was a failure. Securing causeways, marking drop zones, all of it was irrelevant now. Reality had presented them with a new, far more critical task. If those panzers crossed that bridge, they would roll right into the flank of the American forces struggling to get off Utah Beach. 30 lost men, armed with a few captured Panzerfausts and a stolen understanding of the enemy's plan, were the only things standing in their way. Trying to take that bridge was a suicidal, unsanctioned, and probably stupid act of insubordination. It was also the only thing that mattered. The system that was supposed to direct them was an ocean away and an eternity ago. The high command they were theoretically answerable to was a fiction. There was no radio contact, no chain of command reaching down into this bloody, tangled corner of Normandy. The only system that existed here was the one being improvised on the ground, a brutal meritocracy where the man with the map and the plan, no matter his rank, became the leader. That man was Sergeant Frank Miller. But as his small army of strays coalesced, the system, in a way, pushed back. It wasn't a direct order from a general, but the ingrained friction of military culture itself. The lieutenant from the 506th, a fresh-faced West Point graduate named Harris, was technically the senior officer present. He had been trained his entire life to give orders, not take them from a non-commissioned officer. When Miller laid out the audacious plan to assault Bridge Alpha, Harris balked. "Sergeant, our standing orders are to assemble at the regimental rally point," Harris stated, his voice tight with the strain of trying to impose order on a situation that defied it. He gestured vaguely to the southeast. "We don't have the numbers or the authorization to engage a primary enemy strongpoint. We'll be wiped out." It was the voice of the old world, the voice of the plan on paper. It was logical. It was prudent. and it was utterly, fatally wrong. The rally point he was referring to was miles away, and for all they knew, it was overrun. He was trying to follow a rulebook for a game that no longer existed. "Sir," Miller replied, his tone respectful but his eyes hard as flint. He pointed to the German map, spread across the damp grass. "That rally point doesn't matter. This bridge does. The Panzers cross at 0730. That's in 40 minutes. If we're not there, who will be?" The other men, the grimy, exhausted privates and corporals, looked back and forth between the sergeant and the lieutenant. They were witnessing a quiet, desperate battle for the soul of their small group. Would they follow the man with the rank or the man with the intelligence? Would they cling to the ghost of the original plan or embrace the brutal reality of the one unfolding in front of them? "This is an unsanctioned operation," Harris insisted, his authority crumbling. "I cannot authorize this course of action." "With all due respect, Lieutenant," Dawson, the corporal from the 82nd, cut in, his voice flat. "Nobody's asking for your authorization. We're asking if you're coming with us." It was a mutiny, of a sort, not born of malice, but of necessity. The system, represented by Lieutenant Harris, was pushing back with the dead weight of its own protocol. It was demanding they adhere to a plan that was already a catastrophic failure, ordering them to ignore the vital, actionable intelligence sitting right in front of them. The conflict wasn't just with the Germans anymore. It was with the memory of an order, the ghost of a command structure that had been shredded by the chaos of the drop. For a long, tense moment, Harris just stared at the faces of the men, seeing not subordinates, but a jury. He was being asked to choose between his career and his conscience, between the army he was trained for and the one he was now in. He had the rank, but Miller had the truth, and in the crucible of combat, the truth was the only authority that mattered. Lieutenant Harris made his choice. He folded. It wasn't a dramatic surrender, just a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. He couldn't bring himself to endorse Miller's plan, but he wouldn't stand in its way. He and a handful of men who still felt the pull of their original orders broke off from the main group. Their shoulders slumped and headed southeast, chasing the ghost of a rally point they would never find. They were obeying the last order they had received, even though the battlefield had rendered it obsolete. Their departure was the system's final, futile protest. For Miller, it was a bitter victory. He had lost men not to enemy fire, but to the lingering inertia of a failed plan. This was their lowest point. Miller was now in command of roughly 25 men, a force dangerously depleted before the first shot of their real battle had been fired. The confidence that had surged through them when they first found the map now felt thin and brittle. They were about to assault a prepared German defensive position, guarding a vital bridge, with a skeleton crew of disoriented soldiers, armed with a miscellany of American and captured German weapons. They were undermanned, outgunned, and operating completely outside the grand Allied strategy. They were, in effect, their own war. The weight of the decision settled on Miller's shoulders like a physical burden. He looked at the faces of the men who remained. They were exhausted, their eyes hollowed out by lack of sleep and the constant, grinding tension. They were putting their lives in his hands, not because of the stripes on his sleeve, but because of a stolen map and a desperate idea. He was a sergeant playing general, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that his choices would get some, if not all, of these men killed. There was no right answer, only a spectrum of terrible possibilities. The injustice was crushing the men who had seen the truth, who were trying to avert a disaster, were the ones being punished, isolated, and sent on a suicide mission. As they moved through the final hedgerow before the bridge, the catastrophe they were trying to prevent was irrevocably set in motion. The rhythmic, guttural sound of heavy engines reached them on the morning air. It wasn't the distant rumble of the naval guns, this was closer, more menacing. It was the sound of tank treads chewing up a cobblestone road. They were late. Peeking through a gap in the foliage, Miller saw it. The lead element of the German armored column, a Panzer IV, was already approaching the bridge. Its long 75mm cannon swung slowly from side to side, a predator sniffing the air. Behind it, he could see the shapes of more tanks and half-tracks full of infantry. The plan they had was to set up an ambush, to mine the approaches, to create a kill zone. But the enemy's timetable had beaten their own. The Germans were here. The bridge was still theirs. Miller's small band of lost soldiers had failed. The gate was open, and the wolves were about to be let loose on the unsuspecting soldiers fighting for their lives on Utah Beach. The unfolding catastrophe wasn't a rout, it was a street fight, vicious and intimate. The lead panzer clattered onto the stone bridge, its commander, a young lieutenant with blonde hair and an arrogant set to his jaw, standing boldly in the open turret, surveying the seemingly quiet countryside. He was following his orders, adhering to his schedule, confident in the preparations his superiors had made. He had no way of knowing that his entire operational plan was lying on the grass less than 200 yards away, being read by a dozen desperate American paratroopers. From his vantage point, Sergeant Miller watched the moment his world, and the fate of this small corner of the war, balanced on a knife's edge. He had one man, a private named Kowalski who had claimed to have trained with the Panzerfaust, hidden in a ditch with a direct line of sight to the bridge. It was their only real anti-tank weapon. Miller gave the signal a sharp, piercing whistle, like a hawk's cry. The Panzerfaust fired with a great whoosh of smoke and flame. The projectile, a shaped charge of high explosive, streaked across the intervening ground and struck the Panzer IV squarely on its frontal glassy plate. For a horrifying second, nothing happened. The rocket seemed to have been a dud. Then, there was a secondary, internal detonation. A plume of black smoke erupted from the commander's hatch, followed by a gout of orange flame. The tank lurched to a stop, its treads grinding, and then fell silent, a burning steel coffin blocking the center of the bridge. That single, successful shot was the trigger. Chaos erupted. Miller's men opened up with everything they had: M1s, bars, and the captured German MG-42, whose terrifyingly fast rate of fire ripped into the exposed German infantry riding in the half-tracks behind the lead tank. The Germans, caught completely by surprise, spilled out of their vehicles, seeking cover where there was none. They had been expecting a clear run to the coast. Instead, they had driven headlong into a hornet's nest. But the Germans were professionals. Their NCOs quickly restored order, and they began to lay down a disciplined base of fire. The 2nd Panzer in the column opened up with its coaxial machine gun, spraying the hedgerows where Miller's men were concealed, the bullets tearing through the leaves and branches like angry wasps. A mortar began dropping rounds with lethal precision. It wasn't a battle, it was a desperate holding action. Miller's men were trading their lives to buy minutes. They would fire a few rounds from one position, then scramble along the hedgerow to another, creating the illusion of a much larger force. But the arithmetic of combat was brutal and unforgiving. The Germans had numbers, armor, and mortars. Miller had 20-some riflemen and a stolen piece of paper. One by one, his men began to fall. He saw Dawson, the quiet corporal who had found the logbook, take a round to the chest and slump down without a sound. They were stemming the tide, but they were drowning in it at the same time. The tragic irony was palpable. They were dying to correct a mistake that their own high command didn't even know had been made. The firefight for Bridge Alpha raged for nearly 2 hours, a furious, close-quarters affair that had no right to last as long as it did. Miller's dwindling force was finally broken not by the panzers, but by a flanking maneuver from German infantry who had crossed the river downstream. The fight dissolved into a desperate retreat. Miller, wounded by shrapnel in his leg, was among the last to pull back, dragging a private whose face had been shredded by a mortar blast. They left behind 12 dead, including the quiet hero, Corporal Dawson. The bridge was finally taken by the Germans. On paper, it was a failure, a defeat. But they had bought 2 hours. 2 hours that, in the grand, chaotic calculus of D-Day, turned out to be everything. By the time the Germans cleared the wreckage of the 1st Panzer and reorganized their column, the 1st Sherman tanks of the American 4th Infantry Division were already rumbling off the causeways from Utah Beach. The window of opportunity for a devastating armored counterattack had slammed shut. The German panzers, when they finally advanced, ran into an established American front, not a vulnerable beachhead. The battle they fought was a hard one, but it was a battle they were destined to lose. Miller and the handful of survivors from his ad hoc company were eventually absorbed back into the Allied lines, their story lost in the larger, deafening narrative of the Normandy invasion. There were no medals for what they had done. There couldn't be. Their mission was unsanctioned, their command structure improvised, their very existence a violation of the official plan. In the after-action reports, the delay of the German Panzer Company was attributed to hesitant leadership and effective harassment by scattered airborne elements. The system, in its effort to create a clean, coherent history, had smoothed over the messy, accidental truth. Miller's war remained his own secret. Decades passed. The world changed. In 1998, a historian from a small American university, researching a book on German logistical operations in Normandy, was granted access to the recently declassified archives of the German 91st Infantry Division. Buried deep within a mountain of dry, bureaucratic paperwork, he found a folder containing the personal effects of a Major Friedrich Kessler, reported killed in action in the early hours of June 6, 1944, in a farmhouse near St. Miraglise. Inside was Kessler's logbook. The historian, an expert in the German military, immediately recognized its significance. He cross-referenced the meticulously recorded timetables with Allied accounts. Suddenly, a dozen small, inexplicable ambushes and acts of sabotage that had plagued the German rearguard that morning snapped into focus. It wasn't random harassment. It was a coordinated, intelligent, and terrifyingly effective campaign. He found the report from the Panzer Company commander, complaining of a fiercely defended bridge that had delayed him for 2 critical hours, an attack he attributed to a full company of American paratroopers who had somehow been waiting for him. The declassified file didn't just tell a story, it solved a mystery. It revealed that the linchpin holding the western flank of the D-Day landings together wasn't a general's grand strategy, but a dead German major's logbook in the hands of a lost American sergeant. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most pivotal battles in history aren't won by grand armies following perfect plans, but by forgotten soldiers in lonely places, fighting a war that only they can see. And it leaves us with one haunting question: how many other victories like this lie buried, waiting in the dusty archives of the defeated?